Shadi Hamid, Brookings Institution, and American author of several books. The latest one, I believe, is The Problem of Democracy. Let's talk about that, but let's give a little background, okay?
Sure.
Right after 9/11, or right before 9/11, I think it was right after or right before, Colin Powell, Secretary of State for the Bush administration, appoints Charlotte Beers, former advertising executive, to market the United States and its political system to the Arab and Muslim world. And here's a direct quote: "We're selling a product. The product we're selling is democracy. It's a free enterprise system, the American value system. It's a product very much in demand." Well, it turns out it wasn't that much of a product in demand in the United States. In your book, you cover a lot of ground. Let's talk about America's democratic dilemma in the Middle East and all across the world. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the democratic dilemma is this. We as Americans, we like the idea of democracy in theory, but in practice, we're not always comfortable with the outcomes of democracy. So we find ourselves in a kind of bind, especially in regions like the Middle East, where, we as Americans tend to be optimistic and think that good things go together. So if countries democratize, they're going to become more moderate, more secular, more liberal, all these other things as part of this broader package of progress. But when that doesn't happen, we feel disappointed. Sometimes we feel betrayed, and we think to ourselves, these people had freedom, they had democracy, then why did they vote for a far-right party? Or why did they vote for an Islamist party that believes in the implementation of Sharia? So in the case of the Middle East, we see whenever there have been free and fair elections, which hasn't been a lot, but the times where it has happened, including during the Arab Spring, we see groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt coming to power through democratic elections. And then American policymakers, first under the Bush administration, then under Obama, there's a discomfort there, because especially when it comes to secular elites, the role of religion in public life is a little bit difficult to grasp. And in religiously conservative countries, such as in the Middle East, that problem is amplified. That's what drives the dilemma, and we haven't had a good answer for it. And that's why to this day, the U.S. supports repressive regimes across the region. The Middle East stands out as an exception.
Well, Shadi, let's go in the Middle East, and let's give a little background. The United States has not had a good record in the Middle East, and I don't care if it's Republicans or Democrats. It seems like both are oblivious to the region for many, many reasons. I mean, you can go all the way back, early in American, 20th century. More recently, the Bush administration pushes the Israeli government to allow for free and democratic elections in Gaza. The result is Hamas wins and throws Palestinian Authority opposition members off the roof. As you mentioned, later on under the Obama administration, there is the Arab Spring happens. There's a free and democratic election in Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood comes into power. Tunisia is the next example, right? We have democratic election, Islamist parties come in, and the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, I forgot what year they won for promoting democracy in Tunisia, and several years later, we now have a dictator again. In your book, you talk about the difference between democracy and liberalism. Can you talk about that and why they're not working in the middle?
Yeah, so in my book, I try to make this distinction clear because I think there's a tendency to lump these concepts together, liberalism and democracy, when actually they can sometimes be in tension with each other. So when I talk about small d democracy, that's about the rotation of power through regular elections. It's about responsiveness to the voting public. It's about popular sovereignty. It's more procedural in that sense. When we talk about liberalism, we're talking about a set of values that go beyond that. So certain non-negotiable rights, individual autonomy, the kind of basket of freedoms that we associate with the Bill of Rights, the primacy of the individual over the collective, the primacy of reason over revelation, gender equality, minority rights, the list goes on, but those are some of the key elements. And so it does imply this constricted role for religion, generally speaking, that, the liberal wants to see a more so-called rational public discourse, and religion takes you away from that, or that's what the argument would be. So these are two things that for a long time in the US have gone hand in hand. So we just assumed they always would. But in certain contexts that they diverge. And they're even diverging here in America. And finally, I think Americans are getting a little bit of a taste of this dilemma that we have democratic elections, yet illiberal parties and individuals come to power, i.e. Mr. Donald Trump, who is not someone who is particularly committed to the Bill of Rights or these non-negotiable freedoms that are centered around the individual.
We'll get back to the United States. I want to get back to the Middle East if you'll allow. Okay?
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, or 10 years ago, when Erdogan kind of came into power, so 10, 15 years ago, whenever that was, there was talk of Turkish-style democracy, right?
Yeah.
The idea that we can indeed have Islamist governments walk hand in hand with democratic systems. Do you think Turkey is a good example of the conflict between Islam, political Islam, and liberalism?
Yeah, because, as the AK party has been in power under Erdogan, Turkey has become more and more illiberal. There are still competitive elections on the local and national level, but Erdogan has taken various Islamization measures, what I tend to call like soft Islamization. So the sorts of things like Islamizing the educational curriculum, giving financial stipends to get married early, to have additional children, things that are kind of, religiously conservative. But Erdogan has also become more authoritarian. So, you can point to Turkey and say that it was a promising case. We did used to talk about the Turkish model, and now we see what happens. Now, the question is, has Turkey become more authoritarian under Erdogan because Erdogan is an Islamist, or because Erdogan is a human being who likes to concentrate power and is paranoid about his opposition? And that's where I think there are two different interpretations. You can say Turkey shows that Islamist parties turn against democracy, or you can say Turkey shows that oftentimes whoever's in power in secular parties before Erdogan were repressive towards Islamists. So we can look at that as well and say that this is a problem more broadly in Turkey's political culture, and we shouldn't demonize or single out Islamists in particular because it's not just about them.
But let's take that perspective, because I think, in your book, you point to critics of the United States and the so-called hypocrisy regarding how democracy is viewed. In other words, when the United States, we in the United States, we supported dictators all around the Middle East for our own geopolitical interest, right? Hosni Mubarak, the king of Saudi Arabia, the Jordanian king still in power today, we support. The Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas was elected, I don't even remember, more than a decade ago.
Very long time ago.
Right? A fair democratic election. Nobody's talking about the fact that there's a dictatorship in the Palestinian Authority and they didn't have free elections in a long time. But the United States supports these regimes because of local geopolitical interests. Can you talk a little more about that conflict between American political interests and American normative ideology?
Yeah, so I think policymakers have this obsession with stability, and they think incorrectly, in my view, that authoritarian regimes are more reliable. It's easier to deal with them because there's like one person. You don't have to deal with like a fractious parliament and competing parties and all that sort of thing. But I think it's an illusion, because authoritarian regimes seem stable until they're not, and then it's too late. And we should have learned that during the Arab Spring, because a month or two before the Arab Spring started, very few analysts saw anything like that coming. No one would have predicted that Tunisia would have been the site of the first uprising in 2011. So it's a reminder that even if we can't anticipate, mass politics, people coming out to the streets, it can happen, and we got to be prepared for it and think ahead. And I worry that various U.S. administrations fall back on this old style of doing business with dictators. And one thing I do in the book is reconstruct the period leading up to the coup in Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power through elections. Then the Egyptian military intervenes in July 2013 and overthrows Mohammed Morsi. And then there's the worst massacre in modern Egyptian history in August 2013, where more than 1,000 people are killed, Brotherhood supporters. And the U.S. didn't do enough to stop the coup. And I would even go further and say it gave Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the coup leader, what amounted to a green light to proceed with the overthrow of the elected government. And if we look at Algeria going back further in 1992, Western democracies either tacitly or explicitly supported the Algerian military, canceling the second round of elections when an Islamist party was on the verge of coming to power. So what I say is, look, we don't have to like Islamist parties. We can think they're bad, that they have morally abhorrent views on any number of issues, especially when it comes to, things like women's rights, which are obviously important, but it's not for us as Americans to decide how Egyptians should view these issues. We have to let the democratic process play out. Democracy is chaotic and messy in the early years. And the only alternative is to go back to brutal repression. And I just don't think that's sustainable. And I think it's also immoral. And the Middle East has been mired in dictatorial rule, in part because the entire U.S.-led regional order in the Middle East is built around this myth of authoritarian stability. So I say instead, for all of their faults, if Islamist parties win, we have to accept that. If socialist parties win, if liberal party wins, it's not about the outcome. It's about being faithful to the process. And that can produce outcomes that we don't like. And that's why I think tying this to how Americans view American politics is important, because I feel the same way about someone as scary as Donald Trump. If Donald Trump wins fair and square in 2024, God forbid, in my view, and we then, we have to accept that and live to fight another day 4 years later. Democracy is about accepting outcomes, and then if you didn't win, you persuade voters instead of resorting to the deep state or the military. And the deep state is an Egyptian and Turkish concept, and it's been imported now to the U.S. So I think, my interest is offering up what would a full-fledged democracy promotion policy in the Middle East look like if we actually got serious about this and fundamentally went in that direction. Would it be possible? What would be the trade-offs? I try to be clear-eyed about that, because there would be some cost when it comes to our regional security interests. Because Islamist parties, they're not as fond of Israel, let's say. So when it comes to Israel's security, Israel is not going to be happy with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in power, for example. But let's consider those trade-offs and then also look at short-term versus long-term. Sometimes things are messy in the short term, but in the long run, they stabilize.
Shadi, let me challenge some of your thoughts.
Yeah, sure.
And again, obviously, as Americans, we don't want to support dictators. But when the United States helped remove dictators, right, in the case of Libya, for example, or when we didn't, and happened naturally in the case of Syria, look what happened. A complete bloodbath. I mean, in Libya, there's still a civil war. Syria is a nation that's no longer a sovereign nation and really is controlled by Iran. So that's one thing to think about, right? I mean, there is a benefit to strong dictators. I mean, the question is, should the United States promote democracy at all in the Middle East? Is this the role of the United States?
Yeah, those are good questions. And, so when I talk about democracy promotion, I'm not talking about military invasions like Iraq, certainly. Libya, I did actually support the intervention in Libya, because in contexts where there's an impending massacre and, mass killings, that I think that it is reasonable to consider taking action to stop that if we know that it's coming, as we did in Libya in 2011. But I do want to put Libya to the side, because I think the military part, I don't see obvious cases where the U.S. is going to militarily intervene. I think we've moved away from that approach. But when it comes to authoritarian allies, like in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, UAE, Bahrain, we're not going to attack these countries, and no one would consider that, because that would be absurd. These are actually people that we work with. They've been doing stuff with us for a long time. What I'm calling for is using the leverage that we have. So we have large military aid packages to Egypt and Jordan, for example. If we wanted to ground the Saudi military in the matter of weeks, we could, by suspending spare parts and maintenance to their advanced weapon systems. We provide a security umbrella to Saudi Arabia. So I'm not saying that we should tell Saudi Arabia to become democratic overnight. That's not realistic. I think, but we can say that, look, you guys benefit from all the things that we give you. So we would like to ask for certain things in return. One, just be a little bit less repressive, move in the right direction, open up some space for civil society. Don't put all your opponents in prison. Don't arrest people for tweets. do that. In the case of Egypt, Sisi is one of the most brutal dictators around. As I mentioned, there was a massacre that was quite terrible. The list, more than 50,000 people are in prison, and there is no room for dissent. It's even worse than it was under Mubarak in the 2000s. So, if Sisi is getting $1.3 billion of military aid from us, that is not something that Egyptians should get regardless. It shouldn't be a blank check. So the question is, do we continue with the status quo, which basically means subsidizing these regimes that go against our values, but they also, in my view, go against our interest in the long run, because authoritarian regimes aren't reliable. They start making big mistakes, and so.
You're almost articulating the Biden administration's view of Saudi Arabia, but I want to point the finger on Saudi Arabia and look at the last couple of years, right? Before the election, for his election, Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah nation, and he pretty much was dissing Mohammed bin Salman in the early part of the administration. But when oil prices went up and fears of inflation went up, the United States changed its tune. The Saudis, the Gulf nations, the Egyptians have seen the cold shoulder from the Obama administration, the Biden administration, who were trying to kind of say, hey, you need to change your ways if you want to get our support, right? But what they're doing is that they're not changing their ways, they're changing their focus. And you see Saudi Arabia is now talking to China, right? So they're saying, okay, you don't want to give us the umbrella you were talking about, the financial military umbrella. We have other options in the East, China.
No, okay, but I'd actually take a very different lesson from Saudi Arabia. We still provide the security umbrella. Biden has stopped calling MBS a pariah. He's tried to make nice with Mohammed bin Salman. Over the summer, the trip to Saudi Arabia, I think many people would have seen how basically Biden prostrated himself before MBS in Saudi Arabia. I personally thought it was humiliating. But look at how the Saudis responded.
Did you like the fifth bump?
Exactly, yeah. But when you show that kind of weakness to an authoritarian regime, they take advantage of that and exploit it. So instead of lowering oil prices and increasing supply, what did the Saudis do? They basically gave a big FU to the Biden administration and actually cut supply, which was like literally the opposite of what we were trying to get out of the trip to Saudi Arabia in the summer. So there's a lesson here. We give them billions of dollars of these advanced weapon systems, including to this very day. That has not stopped. But Saudi Arabia plays footsie with China and Russia and is moving, developing these trade relationships and even security cooperation in different ways. And they're not helping us on oil supply. And as you might remember, the Saudis kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister years ago. They did the blockade against Qatar. They've been a chaos agent. The war in Yemen. You take all these things and it's not just about values. It's about Saudi Arabia's acting against American interests in all of these particular areas. And why are we acting like we're the junior partner in the relationship? If you were an alien in outer space and you looked at the Biden trip to Saudi Arabia without any additional context, you'd assume that Saudi Arabia was the superpower and Biden's America was the junior partner that was trying to beg for money from Saudi Arabia. We got to reverse this mentality. We are a superpower. We are America.
But that was Trump's approach, right? I mean, Donald Trump, with all of his minuses, when it came to the Middle East, he came in with a very, very pragmatic view, right? He didn't try to change things the way things have worked in Saudi Arabia or Egypt. He's like, look, American interests, counter Iran, we put together the Abraham Accords and built a coalition. So do you support that view better than the Biden administration?
No. I mean, well, so those are maybe two things that are more positive. Yeah, Saudi Arabia counters Iran, but on all the other things that I mentioned, Saudi Arabia was doing things that were contrary to American interests. And this is maybe a little bit of a can of worms. I am not particularly enthusiastic about the Abraham Accords because I believe that it solidifies authoritarian rule. It prioritizes diplomatic accommodation with Israel. But who are the countries that are doing that? Countries like the UAE, Bahrain, two very authoritarian regimes. If there's going to be peace in the region more broadly, there has to be popular buy-in from the people. But if you do an end run and you say, forget about a parliament that ratifies treaties. We're going to have the so-called benevolent dictator making these decisions. It's not addressing the systematic issue of the peoples on both sides not liking, if there is still an Arab-Israeli divide, whatever these dictators do, and that hasn't been addressed. So I think it distracts us from the deeper fissures. It also distracts us from resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because these Arab regimes are doing an end run around the Palestinians. They're saying, that's hopeless, there's not going to be a resolution, let's sideline the Palestinians, and instead, let's do bilateral deals with Israel directly so we can benefit from their technological and economic prowess. It's a very narrow, self-interested view. Is that the solution to the region's woes? I don't think it is. I don't think it's sustainable, because at some point, people will ask for more buy-in into the political system. It's maybe not right away, but in 10 years, 15 years, an anti-Israel sentiment is still the predominant sentiment among Arab populations across the region. So...
Well, listen, we can do another episode on the Israeli issue. No worries. Look, the Middle East is a can of worms, and as I previously said, no American administration really. Maybe George Bush Sr. Maybe most administrations get an F when it comes to foreign affairs in the Middle East. Let's go outside of the region, Middle East. You argue in your book that the problem with democracy is no longer just in the Middle East. The polarizing effect of identity, culture, and religion are now haunting the world's oldest democracy. Let's shift the conversation to the United States and to Europe.
Yes. So in some ways, the Middle East was ahead of its time. And that's why we can learn a lot from what the Middle East has gone through, because the Middle East had identity politics before it was cool. I mean, starting with the Islamic revival in the 1970s, it stopped being the traditional left-right spectrum around economics and class divides, and everything became about culture, identity, the nature of the nation state, the role of religion in public life. These are all sort of existential cultural issues. It's harder to split the middle on them because they're intangible. When we're talking about marginal tax rates, you literally are dealing with numbers, and you can split the middle and find a compromise more easily. But how do you split the middle on one's personal relationship with God, or the role of Sharia? These are things where the stakes are higher, and the Middle East has really struggled with that. And that's why I talk about the Islamist dilemma, which is basically the fundamental unresolved issue in the Middle East is Arabs and Muslims can't agree on the role of religion, and specifically Islam, in public life. If you get 10 Muslims in a room, they'll have different views of the role that Islam should play. And until you find a way to accommodate those discussions and debates in a democratic process where people commit to resolving that question through elections instead of one side oppressing the other, that's what you have to have. And the Middle East hasn't been able to find that settlement around these very stark identity issues. So, I thought the U.S. didn't. So I remember, like in the days of the Obama administration, we were still talking about things like deficits, healthcare reform, Obama's tan suit. It wasn't existential. In some ways, a lot of this stuff seemed like, pretty normal and not high stakes. I come back to DC in 2014 after the failure of the Arab Spring, and I start to see America changing. That no longer are we talking about tax cuts and privatizing Social Security and those kinds of policy issues. It starts to be the future of the republic. When people were debating between Trump and Hillary in 2016, they weren't looking at all their policy proposals and doing kind of cost-benefit analysis. They were saying Trump represents a different vision of what America can become. It became culture war nonstop, and we see this to this very day. Cancel culture, identity politics, racial divisions, the role of Christianity, secularization, trans rights, abortion. These are all primarily culture war issues. The Middle East went through that, and now we're doing it in our own way. Obviously, there are major differences. I mean, our fundamental divide is not about religion. That said, religion is a predictor of political and ideological affiliation. So if you are a Christian evangelical, you're much more likely to be a member of the Republican Party. If you're a secular person, you're more likely to be on the Democratic side of the spectrum. So this is where we're at now, and I think that luckily it chilled a little bit with the encouraging results in our recent midterm elections, but I think there are still a lot of open questions about are Americans going to accept the outcome in 2024 if the side that they don't like wins? And this, to me, is the problem of democracy. What do we do when democracy produces bad outcomes? And I think it's up to each and every individual to ask themselves, that, like, for example, take your worst case scenario. If you are a supporter of the Democratic Party, imagine if Trump wins, as I mentioned, or DeSantis. How are you going to be able to process that? Will you consider it legitimate? If Democrats win in 2024 and it's close, will we see something like January 6th again? Will we see Republicans en masse refusing to accept the legitimacy of a second Biden victory?
Let me give you a different paradigm on this. Maybe it's not just cultural. When you take the focus away from the United States, away from the Middle East, away from Europe specifically, there has been an argument that the key paradigm here is about globalization and anti-globalization movement, right? Globalization says your religion doesn't matter, your nationality doesn't matter, countries don't matter. You can move from Afghanistan to Sweden, right? And a month later, you're considered just as Swedish as somebody who's been there for 400 years. And if you disagree with that statement, you're racist, right? So we see like a blurring of identity by the globalization movement. And what you now see is a counter reaction. You see the rise of the far right. You see distrust in institutions, at universities, in media, in Hollywood, right? So this is something that we see all across the world. You're talking about January 6th. We had in Brazil last week, the supporters of Bolsonaro storm the Capitol. In Peru, we have riots over, democracy right now. So in the United States, in Peru, in Brazil, we see it everywhere. We see the rise of the far right in Europe. So the tension between globalization and anti-globalization is another interesting paradigm that may reflect on how democracy is viewed and how people trust or distrust institutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And we're seeing how concepts travel. Like, so Brazilians, they saw what happened in our own country at the Capitol of January 6th, and they did something that was sort of modeled after that. And I mentioned the term deep state. Deep state is now a common term in the American public discourse. It was imported from the Middle East. So these wokeness, we see, the advance of woke ideas in the UK. So when we had our summer 2020 protests around Black Lives Matter, there were corresponding protests in various places in Europe, in particular in the UK, where they saw what was happening in the streets of America and they were able to relate to that. It just shows the cultural power of America. Even when people talk about the decline of American influence and whatever it might be, people still do look to America. They don't look to, they don't look to China. In fact, people see China as a cautionary tale of what not to do. Like, don't embrace absurd zero COVID policies and reverse them overnight. And then they're still dealing with this, 4 years later. So I think that, you can't keep ideas siloed in particular countries. And that actually, I think, amplifies a lot of the existential feeling. We're just bombarded with information and experiences from other places. We're on social media, so it has the effect of flattening a lot of these debates. And so people are just they're sort of assaulting themselves with all of these strong feelings in politics. Like, everything seems political all the time, especially if you're a well-educated person who wants to make their country better. You're just going to be very politicized, and you're going to see the opposing side as an enemy. And this is maybe I'll just also add this. The key then is, how do we lower the existential stakes of politics? Like, if you take my premise that these identity divides are very stark and intense and people feel like everything's about to fall apart, what can we do as individual citizens to lower the stakes? And that's why when people say this is the most important election of your life, that's always a red flag to me, because one election should never be the most important election of your life. Well, first of all, you don't know if that's true, because if every election is the most important election of your life, well, they can't all be the most important election. And you shouldn't put so much hope into one election, because you're bound to be disappointed. You raise your expectations. You're like, the future of the republic is at stake. And if things don't go your way, how are you going to react? And that's why sometimes we have to shift attention to faith, family, friends, community, the local aspect. And and come to terms with the fact that we won't always get our way in the democratic process. And that's okay. It shouldn't be the end of the world.
Right. So let's end this interview on an optimistic note.
Yes,
okay.
Please.
As you said, politicians, they have to bring up the cultural wars, and that's how you get the vote, us versus them. If we don't win, it's the end of the world. What's the solution do you see?
Well, part of it's this. I mean, don't try not to view your opponents as enemies to be defeated. We are all American, if we just kind of focus on our own context here, both of us in the U.S. now, that if we are all American citizens, we're going to have to learn to live with each other. If there's 74 million Trump voters are not going to disappear, you can't coerce them into silence. You can't put them in a little box and ignore them. You can't dismiss them as deplorables because that will backfire. So in that sense, there is something very practical that individuals can do. Learn to be comfortable with someone who you would otherwise consider to be your enemy. This doesn't mean agree with them. I actually very much am of the view that people should be open about their convictions, and you shouldn't suppress what you feel. If you have very strong views on banning abortion, that might be abhorrent to someone else, but that should be part of a legitimate debate. That shouldn't be off the table. You have to listen to the other person's view, and you say, listen, I think your view is bad, but you still have the right to vote. And I have to respect that because we're not going anywhere. You have to accept me and I have to accept you.
Would you say, and I hope I don't get in trouble for asking this question, but I think that me even putting this warning label before puts my finger on the point. Would you say that the woke movement is hurting democracy because it's suppressing speech from both sides?
Yeah, it's contrary to the democratic spirit. It does seek to demonize people who diverge from this very narrow woke consensus, which in my view is kind of crazy. I mean, I vote for the Democratic Party. I am a Democrat, but I think a lot of us, not to open another can of worms, but I think you see a growing number of brown folk in America, Hispanics, Arabs, Muslims, black men to some extent, who are getting sick of the wokeness. And it goes against the religious conservatism that you see in some of these minority communities. And the idea that you have to be anti-racist means to have these like ultra woke views, and then you suppress ideas that don't fit into that. That just makes people afraid to share their true opinions, and that creates a climate of distrust. And cancel culture is real. People can sometimes say, "Oh, well, cancel culture is exaggerated." No, I mean, all the available polls we have show pretty clearly that a growing number of Americans are not comfortable sharing certain opinions publicly on campus. If you're a professor, this is a real thing, and that's not promising for learning to live with the other. If you see anyone who votes for Trump as automatically a racist, that's not going to be good for democracy if you think the entire other party is racist. So, but luckily, I think some of this woke stuff is subsiding somewhat. I think there has been pushback and resistance, including from people of color, saying enough is enough. We don't want to be... If I'm brown, I don't want people to assume that I have a particular view because they look at me, Shadi, he's Muslim, he's Arab. That means I can predict his views. No, I'm an individual. And ultimately, that's what America's about, is each individual has agency and makes choices. And that's how we should judge people, as individuals and not as representatives of a certain narrow group identity.
Right. I could continue and talk to you all day long, but we said we're going to do about 20 minutes and we're up. If people want to get your book, can you give a little more background and where they can contact you?
Sure.
And more about what you do.
Yeah, my book is called The Problem of Democracy. It's available for purchase at your favorite bookstore, Amazon, wherever you get your books. You can find me on Twitter at Shadi Hamid. First name, last name. I also am on Substack at shadihamid.substack.com. I write a monthly essay for The Atlantic. You can find those on my Atlantic author page. And feel free to say hello on Twitter.
Perfect. And we will put every single one of those links in the show notes, comment section. So thank you all for tuning in. Shadi, thanks so much for coming in and speaking to the Public Diplomat, episode number 20.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Guy.
Have a good day.
You too.